So let's look at and we, just like we saw with let me get my pen. Just like we saw with the backdoor Roth IRA example, when you're not working with a certain form all the time, then obviously that's one of the reasons to do these kind of exercises, right? Is before you get into the real thing, you're working with a fake example, and you kind of get familiar with that particular form that's key to that scenario. So in California is a community property state, right? So what does that generally mean?
50-50.
50-50, right? So if you own assets that, and you're married, your spouse owns 50% of that. There are certain ways to like kind of, do some alternative variations of that, as like the attorneys and tax people, we share that in common with attorneys, right? There's like the general rule, and then there's the paperwork that you can do to do it differently.
Alternate rule.
Right. So, but in general, when you're in a community property state, it's 50-50, not only for assets, right, but for income, right? So when somebody wants to file married filing separately, what in your guys' experience is the main motivation why somebody would be interested in filing separately?
Because they're separated?
Okay, that's a good one.
Because they're not living together?
They're not talking?
Because
Right.
they don't come to
Maybe because
the communication has broken down,
one
sure.
of them is self-employed and they're gonna owe taxes and they don't
Right,
wanna
which will
like.
lead to further breakdowns in communication, right?
Yeah, one person makes a lot of money, the other one makes very little.
But that's actually a reason not to file separate. That's usually a scenario where I will not try to convince, but I will educate my client on why we should.
I feel like maybe also the tax liability, like some people just don't, that's your balance, not mine, I don't wanna get.
Yeah, especially for self-employed,
Yeah.
right? So couple those keywords, like it's a messy situation, we're barely talking, every time we talk, it
It's
breaks.
not enough.
Yeah, you don't wanna get involved, and you're like, yes, you're right, I don't wanna get involved, but I still need to make sure that your situation's optimized for taxes, right? So when you go to, and then the other thing is that self-employment. So I'm sick of paying, especially if we're not together anymore, I'm sick of having my W-2 withholdings go to pay your taxes that you don't pay. Because every year the tax person says you should be making estimated payments, and you're like, walk out of there, I forgot about that already. I forgot about those words when they were coming out of your mouth. I was like, selective hearing,
It's uncomfortable.
I'm so good at not hearing. Yeah, they're the ones past like, so let me see something's happening here. I think I may have identified it. I'm paying your taxes.
Yeah. Then when they ask you for the details, you're just like, okay, and then they look at them like, so you're gonna give me my refund. Yeah. You're paying for it.
Right, you're at least gonna take care of the tax prep fee.
Yeah.
Okay, right. So those are the overall issues that you see, and then on the forms level, this form 8958, if you're in a community property state, if you go to file married filing separately, why do you think LaCert, like our tax software, why do you think it has a checkbox of living with spouse? Because it's going to apply the community property rules for the state at that point, which is going to involve splitting all of the income onto two returns. In other words, if you're not living with a spouse, like imagine a scenario like where they have broken up and they're living separately. The self-employed person is just raking in the money without paying any taxes, which is like the goal for a lot of people for that situation, right? And then the other spouse, paying in the withholdings, but the other spouse, if they're not living together, they're not getting benefit from that self-employment income in the same way. Right? So when you check that box, living with spouse, that's going to, within the program, and we talked about applying the software to how the law works, right? It's going to trigger needing to fill out this 8958 and allocate the income, right? So when you file separately, you're not which is why this kind of client can be, like I know for me, if I would get this kind of client, especially towards a deadline, it feels like a big commitment because you have to discuss a lot of things with them, and what they're actually trying to do, they're not going to achieve. So what I'm trying to do by filing separately is I'm sick of paying this person's tax on their self-employment income. So I just want them to just handle their own thing and get saddled with their own tax debt, like they deserve, because you know how they are. That's kind of like, sometimes it's at that point. You know what they've been doing every year. I just want them to pay their own taxes. So in a community property state where you're getting the benefit of that income, it's really not an option, right? So now you have a situation with a client where exactly why I'm here and why I'm trying to get you to do is not going to be able to happen, right? At least not in any kind of like clean way, right? So now you're into working with this 8958, and you're allocating half of the income or different percentages of the income to each spouse, right?
Correct.
How do you enjoy filling out the 8958s as much as I do, or less?
A lot
Or
less.
more.
Usually when we're dealing with it, it's, we get one out of the two spouses. So it's even much harder, because a lot of times that spouse doesn't even know what.
Or their social, doesn't even know their spouse's social, and it's like, I don't talk to him. Well, I still need to file with his social, so you're gonna have to call him.
I had someone that had been separated for 4 years, and the other person was still filing separately, and she didn't know any information about them at all, like anything social. Only birthday, of course, but.
So for those situations where the person hasn't been receiving the benefit of that other spouse's income, that's where we talked about with these technical, where it's like getting into the weeds of a scenario and then like doing all this research and like tax code and all of this, you start reading like all this stuff that's really hard to understand, et cetera, right? Getting into that vortex, but understanding first, like, what is the overall thing that we're trying to address here, right? Because if you're not receiving the benefit of that income, it is kind of like you're just handling your own reporting of income, right? So you would have a basis for allocating differently, or maybe you don't even have the information to do this form. So it's just like you're filling out the form to get the tax return in, but you're really just doing the best you can.
Right.
Yeah.
But you understand that from a tax evasion or illegitimate tax avoidance point, you don't have that much exposure because the person's not getting that self-employment income and paying their car payment, or paying the huge house payment where they're living, right? As opposed to people that are living in the same house and, right?
Yeah.
And so the other thing on the self-employment aspect is liability for the tax. How does that change on a married filing jointly return versus separately? Because again, that's one of the main goals that married filing separate client a lot of times wants to have happen, is me not being responsible for your tax.
So the liability, like if they're married and there's a balance, they're both liable for that balance.
Right.
So I
Fully
have,
for the entire balance.
right. So I have clients that filed jointly while they were married and then got separated, divorced, whatever, and they're upset with me because their refunds are being taken to cover that liability that they had as a joint couple, right? Because this self-employed spouse is still not paying anything, and they're taking the full amount, like they're equally liable for the full amount.
Right.
So it's gonna keep happening until that is, taken care of.
Because there's no refunds to collect on the other side.
Right.
So from a tax collector point of view, that's what you would always want, is joint and several liability, right? So when you see all the penalties that the tax code puts in for married filing separately to make it more and more difficult, right? To make it so that as professionals, we're like, I would prefer really that you file jointly. The numbers are gonna look better, it's gonna be easier, you're not gonna have to do all these kind of things, right? That's because it's so much easier to collect. So when you go into married filing separately, even if you're responsible for half the tax, maybe that's better than the entire tax.
Yeah, that's true.
Right? Because you still kind of, if you've communicated with your professional effectively, you kind of understand, you're actually right. I am actually getting the benefit of this income. This is a, you know,
If it's
so.
a joint union.